Barrett Langston rode through the dry Texas plains, the setting sun painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Dust clung to his boots, his clothes, even his skin, proof of another long day spent chasing strays and mending fences. His muscles ached, his throat burned with thirst, but he didn't slow his horse. There was always more work to be done. The ranch stretched before him, acres of land that had once thrived under his father's care. Now, the fences sagged in places, the barn roof leaked when it rained, and the cattle were thinner than they should be. Barrett saw it all, and the weight of it settled deeper into his bones with each passing day. He dismounted outside the ranch house, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud. The place was quiet, too quiet. No sound of his father's voice calling out a greeting. No smell of supper cooking on the stove. Just the wind rustling through the grass and the distant lowing of a cow. Something was wrong. Barrett pushed open the front door, the hinges creaking in protest. The house was dim inside, the curtains drawn tight against the fading light. His father should have been at the table, going over the ledgers, or in his chair by the fireplace, pipe in hand. But instead, the room was empty. A cough came from the bedroom, harsh, ragged. Barrett's stomach twisted. He strode across the room and pushed open the door to find his father propped up in bed, his face pale, his breathing labored. The doctor sat beside him, his expression grim. "About time you got back," his father muttered, though there was no real anger in his voice, just exhaustion. Barrett ignored the remark, his eyes locked on the doctor. "How bad is it?" The doctor sighed. "Your father's heart is weak. He needs rest, and he needs to stop worrying about things he can't control." Barrett clenched his jaw. His father had always been a proud man, stubborn as the day was long. He'd worked this land for decades, built it from nothing. The thought of him lying here, helpless, made something inside Barrett burn. The doctor packed his bag and stood. "I'll be back tomorrow. Make sure he stays in bed." Barrett gave a short nod, and the man left, the front door clicking shut behind him. Silence settled over the room, thick and heavy. His father shifted against the pillows, his gaze sharp despite his weakened state. "We need to talk." Barrett dragged a chair closer and sat, his hands resting on his knees. "If this is about the herd, It's not about the cattle." His father cut him off with a wave of his hand. "It's about the ranch. About you." Barrett frowned. "What about me?" His father took a slow breath, as if gathering strength. "You're 30 years old, Barrett. You've spent your life working this land, but you've never built anything for yourself. No family. No future beyond the next season." Barrett stiffened. "I've kept this place running." "Barely." His father's voice was quiet but firm. "The debts are piling up. The bank's been sniffing around. If something happens to me..." "Nothing's going to happen to you." The words came out rough, almost angry. His father ignored him. "I made a promise a long time ago. To an old friend. A good man. He's gone now. But his daughter, she's still out there." Barrett's stomach dropped. He knew where this was going. "No, you'll marry her." His father's voice left no room for argument. "It was agreed upon years ago. Her name is Susanna Bellamy." Barrett shot to his feet, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not marrying some woman I've never met just because you made a deal." His father's eyes flashed. "You will if you want to save this ranch." Barrett froze. "What?" "The Bellamys have land. Good land. And money. Marrying her ties our families together. It's the only way to keep the bank from taking everything." Barrett's hands curled into fists. He'd known things were bad, but not this bad. There has to be another way. "There isn't." His father's voice softened. "I wouldn't ask this of you if there was." Barrett turned away, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He'd spent his life working, sacrificing, doing what needed to be done to keep this ranch alive. And now this. A marriage to a stranger. A woman he didn't know, didn't love. But what choice did he have? His father spoke again, quieter this time. "She's a good woman, Barrett. Quiet. Kind. She's been through hardships of her own." Barrett didn't care. It didn't matter if she was kind or quiet or anything else. This wasn't about her. It was about the ranch, about survival. He turned back to his father, his voice flat. "Fine, I'll do it." Relief flickered across the older man's face. "You won't regret it." Barrett didn't answer. He already knew he would. The letter was sent the next morning. Short, to the point. A proposal of marriage, though it felt more like a business transaction. Barrett didn't sign it with flowery words or promises of love. Just his name. And then they waited. Days passed. His father grew weaker, though he refused to admit it. Barrett threw himself into work, trying not to think about the woman who might soon share his home, his name, his life. Finally, a reply came. Barrett stood in the doorway of the ranch house as the postman handed him the envelope. His name was written on the front in neat, careful script. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the words. "Mr. Langston, I accept your proposal. I will arrive on the stagecoach next Tuesday. Yours, Susanna Bellamy." That was it. No questions. No demands. Just simple acceptance. Barrett folded the letter and shoved it into his pocket. It was done. In a week, he'd have a wife. And nothing would ever be the same. The morning of Susanna's arrival dawned bright and clear, the Texas sun already hot even at such an early hour. Barrett stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the stagecoach station, his hat pulled low over his eyes to shield them from the glare. Around him, the town of Cedar Ridge was slowly coming to life. Shopkeepers sweeping their porches, horses clip-clopping down the dusty street, children laughing as they darted between buildings. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He shouldn't be this nervous. This wasn't a real marriage. It was a business arrangement, a means to an end. And yet, his stomach twisted as the distant rumble of wheels reached his ears. The stagecoach rolled into town in a cloud of dust. The horses lathered and tired from their journey. Barrett straightened as the driver pulled to a stop, the wooden vehicle creaking as it settled. A few passengers stepped out. A traveling salesman, an elderly couple, a young man with a satchel of books. And then there she was, Susanna Bellamy. She emerged slowly, her movements careful, as if she wasn't quite sure of her footing. She wore a simple dress, the color of faded lavender, and a bonnet that shaded her face. But what caught Barrett's attention, what made his breath itch just slightly, was the veil, a delicate lace curtain, covering her features from view. Whispers rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Barrett heard the murmurs. "Why is she wearing that? Is she hiding something? I heard she's plain as a post." His jaw tightened. He didn't care what she looked like. This wasn't about that. Steeling himself, he stepped forward. "Miss Bellamy?" She turned toward his voice, her head tilting slightly. Even through the veil, he could feel her gaze on him, assessing, measuring. "Mr. Langston," she said softly. Her voice was quiet, but there was a steadiness to it that surprised him. He nodded. The preacher's waiting. No courtship, no flowers or sweet words, just straight to the vows. She didn't protest, just lifted the small bag at her feet, her only luggage, and followed him. The church was empty save for the preacher, an old friend of Barrett's father who had agreed to perform the ceremony without question. The man gave Susanna a kind smile as they entered, though his eyes flickered with curiosity at the veil. Barrett didn't explain. The words were spoken quickly, without flourish. "Do you take this woman? Do you take this man?" Susanna's "I do" was barely above a whisper. Barrett's was gruff, clipped. And then it was done. They were married. The preacher cleared his throat. "You may now kiss the bride." Barrett stiffened. He hadn't thought about this part. Susanna seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and lifted the veil. And for the first time, Barrett saw her. She wasn't plain. Her face was delicate, her skin pale like porcelain, dotted with faint freckles across her nose. Her eyes, a shade of soft brown, warm as honey, met his without flinching. And her lips, though pressed together in quiet nervousness, were full and pink. But it wasn't just her features that struck him. It was the quiet strength in her expression, The way she held his gaze, unflinching, even though he could see the pulse fluttering in her throat. Beautiful. The thought came unbidden, startling him. He didn't kiss her, just gave a stiff nod and turned away. Behind him, he heard the rustle of fabric as she lowered the veil once more. The ranch house had never felt so small. Barrett stood in the doorway, watching as Susanna stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. The place was clean but sparse. A wooden table, a few chairs, a fireplace that hadn't seen a proper fire in weeks. His mother's things still sat on the shelves, untouched since her passing years ago. Susanna's fingers brushed the spine of a Bible on the mantel, her touch feather-light. "This was your mother's?" she asked. Barrett's shoulders tensed. "Yes." She didn't pry, just nodded and set her bag down. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "I'll show you to your room," he finally said. "Your room, not ours." She followed him down the narrow hallway to a small bedroom at the back of the house. It had been his mother's sewing room once, but he'd cleared it out as best he could. A bed, a wash basin, a single chair by the window. Susanna stepped inside, her hands clasped in front of her. "Thank you." Barrett nodded. "Supper's at 6. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." And with that he left. The next few days passed in much the same way. Barrett working from dawn till dusk, Susanna keeping to herself inside the house. He'd see her sometimes, through the window, moving quietly from room to room. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything. But then, one morning, he came in from the fields to find her in the garden. The patch of land behind the house had been overgrown for years, choked with weeds. But now Susanna knelt in the dirt, her skirts tucked around her, her hands working the soil with surprising skill. Barrett stopped, watching as she carefully planted a row of seedlings, tomatoes, by the look of them. She sensed his presence and glanced up, her cheeks flushed from the sun. "I hope you don't mind," she said. "The soil here is good. It just needed tending." Barrett didn't know what to say. No one had touched this garden since his mother. He grunted, "Do what you want." But as he walked away, he couldn't help but glance back. She was already back to work, her movements sure and steady. And for the first time in a long time, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shutters and sending dust swirling through the ranch yard. Barrett stood in the open barn doorway, squinting against the stinging grit as he watched the black clouds roll in. The air smelled of rain and something sharper, the metallic tang of an approaching storm. "Boss, we need to get those yearlings moved." Hank, his lead ranch hand, shouted over the rising gale. Barrett nodded, already striding toward the corral, where the young cattle milled nervously. "Get the boys on the west fence line first. If that goes, we'll lose half the herd." Lightning split the sky as they worked, the first fat raindrops beginning to pelt the dry earth. Barrett's shirt clung to his back within minutes, the fabric soaked through with rain and sweat. He barely noticed the sting when a splintered fence post tore into his forearm as they forced the last of the skittish calves into the safety of the barn. The ranch hands scattered to their own homes as the storm reached its fury. Barrett made one last check of the outbuildings before turning toward the house, his boots sinking into the suddenly muddy ground. A flash of movement near the chicken coop caught his eye. Susanna, struggling to secure the flapping door against the wind, her bonnet long gone and her dark hair whipping about her face like a banner. "What are you doing out here?" Barrett had a shout to be heard over the storm as he reached her side. The hinges were loose. She had to rise on tiptoe to refasten the latch, rain streaming down her cheeks. "I couldn't let the foxes." A deafening crack cut her off as the old cottonwood near the house split, a massive branch crashing down onto the roof of the back porch. Barrett reacted without thinking, grabbing Susanna around the waist and yanking her back, just as shattered wood and debris exploded across the path where she'd been standing. For one frozen moment, they stood there, his arms locked around her, her breath coming in quick gasps against his chest. The storm raged around them, but all Barrett could focus on was the rapid flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers, where they still pressed against her wrist. Then she stiffened. "You're hurt." Barrett looked down, only then noticing the blood streaking his forearm where the post had gouged him. "It's nothing," Susanna's mouth said in a firm line he was coming to recognize. Without a word, she took his uninjured arm and pulled him toward the house. The kitchen was dim, the storm blocking most of the afternoon light. Susanna lit 2 lamps before motioning for Barrett to sit at the table. He watched as she moved with quiet efficiency, fetching a basin of water, a clean cloth, and a small tin from the shelf. "Where did you learn doctoring?" Barrett asked as she began cleaning the wound. "The sisters at St. Agnes taught me." Her fingers were surprisingly steady as she worked. "I tended the infirmary for 3 years." The herbal salve she smoothed over the injury smelled faintly of lavender and something earthy. Barrett studied the top of her bent head, noticing for the first time the faint golden strands mixed in with the brown of her hair where it had begun to dry. "You could have been hurt," he said abruptly, "going out in that storm." Susanna tied off the bandage with a neat knot before meeting his eyes. "So could you." A particularly violent gust shook the house, making the lamp flames dance. The storm would last through the night. Barrett found himself oddly reluctant to retreat to the solitude of his room. Sister Marguerite used to say storms were God's way of reminding us we're not in control, Susanna said softly, placing the medical supplies back in their tin. Barrett snorted. "Sounds like something my mother would say." Susanna smiled then, just a slight curve of her lips, but it transformed her entire face. "I think I would have liked your mother." The word should have made him flinch. His mother's absence was still a raw wound, but somehow, coming from Susanna, they didn't hurt. Barrett stood at the corral fence, watching as Susanna knelt beside a struggling newborn calf in the far pen. 3 days had passed since the storm, and he'd noticed the way she'd taken to checking the animals each morning, moving among them with a quiet confidence that seemed to settle even the most skittish creatures. The ranch hands had noticed too. "Don't know what kind of magic she's working, but that heifer was dead set against feeding her baby yesterday," Hank remarked, coming to lean on the fence beside Barrett. "Now look at him." Indeed, the mother cow stood placidly as the calf nursed, Susanna's slender hand resting lightly on the animal's flank. The morning sun caught the strands of gold in her hair, turning them to fire. Barrett grunted. "She's got a way with animals." Hank chewed on a piece of straw, eyeing his boss sideways. "Got away with more than that. Fixed up Billy's hand yesterday when he'd burned it on the branding iron. Didn't so much as squeak about it neither." Barrett's fingers tightened on the fence rail. He'd seen the way some of the younger hands looked at Susanna when they thought he wasn't watching. Not disrespectfully, exactly, but with an appreciation that set his teeth on edge. "Tell the boys to mind their manners," he said shortly. Hank's eyebrows rose, but he wisely changed the subject. "We moving the herd to North Pasture tomorrow?" Barrett nodded, his eyes still on Susanna as she stood, brushing straw from her skirts. The simple calico dress she wore was faded from washing, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. But there was something about the way she carried herself, back straight, chin lifted just slightly, that made her seem anything but plain. As if sensing his gaze, she turned and met his eyes across the distance. For a heartbeat, neither of them looked away. Then one of the hands called for him, and the moment broke. Later that evening, Barrett found himself standing outside Susanna's closed bedroom door, his hand raised to knock before he caught himself. What would he even say? That he'd noticed how hard she worked? That the ranch hands respected her? That when she touched his arm to tend his wound, he'd felt something shift inside him? He lowered his hand and turned away. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the quiet sound of the house, he realized with a start that he was listening for something. The soft rustle of Susanna moving about her room, the faint creak of the floorboards as she prepared for bed. And that scared him more than any storm ever could. The sound of approaching horses brought Barrett out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. A cloud of dust rose from the road, and as it cleared, Barrett's shoulders tensed. Victor Dayne, the man, rode at the head of 4 others, his expensive black suit stark against the dusty landscape. His smile was all teeth as he reined in his horse, just feet from where Barrett stood. Well, if it isn't Barrett Langston," Victor drawled, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with obvious calculation. "Still clinging to this patch of dirt, I see." Barrett kept his voice even, though his hands clenched at his sides. "What do you want, Dayne?" Victor swung down from his saddle with practiced ease, brushing invisible dust from his sleeves. "Just paying a neighborly visit. Heard you got yourself a wife." His gaze flicked toward the house, though I can't imagine why any woman would tie herself to a failing ranch. Before Barrett could respond, the screen door creaked open. Susanna stepped onto the porch, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip. She paused when she saw the gathering, her eyes darting from Barrett to the strangers. Victor's smirk widened. "Ah, this must be the famous Mrs. Langston." He swept off his hat in an exaggerated bow. "Victor Dayne, at your service." Susanna didn't move from the porch. "Mr. Dayne." Her voice was cool, polite, but her knuckles had whitened around the basket handle. Victor's gaze raked over her, lingering too long on her worn dress, her loosely pinned hair. "I must say, Langston, I expected more." He chuckled, glancing at his companions. But then, desperate men make desperate choices, don't they? Barrett took a step forward, his blood roaring in his ears. But before he could speak, Susanna descended the porch steps, setting the basket aside. "And what choices have you made, Mr. Dayne?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild, "other than riding onto another man's land to insult his wife?" Victor's smile faltered. One of his men coughed to cover a laugh. Barrett stared at Susanna. The quiet woman who barely spoke at meals now stood straight-backed, her chin lifted, her eyes steady. There was no fear in her, only a quiet challenge that made Victor shift uncomfortably. Victor recovered quickly, his voice dripping with false charm. "My apologies, ma'am. I only meant that a woman like you deserves finer things." He gestured to the ranch. "This place is barely holding on. Why, I'd wager another season and the bank will—" "The bank will do nothing," Susanna interrupted, "because this land has been in the Langston family for 3 generations, and it will stay that way." Victor's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth to retort when one of his men grabbed his arm. "Boss, we got business in town," the man muttered, nodding toward the darkening sky. Victor shook him off, but turned back to his horse. "This isn't over, Langston." He shot Susanna a look that made Barrett step between them. "You might want to teach your wife when to hold her tongue." Barrett's voice was low, dangerous. "Get off my land." Victor mounted up, his smirk returning. "Enjoy your little victory. I'll be back for what's mine." As the riders disappeared in another cloud of dust, Barrett turned to Susanna. She had retrieved her basket, but her hands were trembling. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Susanna met his gaze. "Yes, I did." And with that, she walked back into the house, leaving Barrett standing in the yard, realizing for the first time that Victor hadn't just come for the land. He'd come for Susanna. Barrett found the trunk in the attic, buried under a pile of old saddles and broken tools. His mother's name was carved into the wood, the letters faded with time. He hadn't opened it since her death, couldn't bear to sort through her things when the grief was still fresh. But tonight, after Victor's visit, he needed something. A connection to the past, maybe. To the woman who had always known what to say, what to do. The hinges groaned as he lifted the lid. The scent of lavender and old paper wafted out, so familiar it made his throat tighten. Inside were dresses carefully folded, a few books, a jewelry box, and at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, a small, framed painting. Barrett unwrapped it slowly. The portrait showed a young girl, maybe 12, with solemn eyes and a shy smile. There was something hauntingly familiar about her, the shape of her face, the way her hands were folded in her lap. Beneath the image, written in his mother's elegant script, was a single line of scripture. "The Lord sees not as man sees." Barrett turned the frame over. On the back, another note in his mother's hand. "My dearest friend's daughter, Susanna. May God watch over her always." His breath caught. This was Susanna. Years before hardship had etched lines into her face, before loneliness had made her shoulders bow. This was the girl his mother had loved like family. The pieces fell into place. Why his father had been so insistent on the marriage, why Susanna had accepted so readily. Their families had been connected long before either of them knew it. Barrett carried the portrait downstairs, his mind racing. He found Susanna in the kitchen, kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. She looked up as he entered, her hands stilling when she saw what he held. Her lips parted. "Where did you find that?" "In my mother's things." He set the portrait on the table between them. "You knew her." Susanna wiped her hands on her apron before reaching out, her fingers hovering just above the painted girl's face. "She was kind to me. When no one else was." Barrett studied her, the woman she'd become, the quiet strength in her that had nothing to do with appearances. He thought of Victor's sneer, of the way the townsfolk whispered, of how blind he'd been. "The Lord sees not as man sees," he murmured, reading the scripture aloud. Susanna's eyes lifted to his, bright with unshed tears. "Your mother wrote that the day she gave me this portrait," she said. Her voice wavered. "She said most people only look at the surface, but God sees the heart." Barrett reached out then, his calloused fingers brushing against hers where they rested on the table. For the first time since they'd met, he truly saw her, not as the woman he'd been forced to marry, but as someone who had been part of his life far longer than he'd realized. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. Neither of them moved, the portrait between them a bridge to the past, and maybe, just maybe, to a future neither had dared hope for. The acrid smell of smoke woke Barrett from a dead sleep. He bolted upright, his heart hammering against his ribs before his feet even hit the floor. Through the window, an ominous orange glow flickered against the night sky. The barn. Barrett was out the door in seconds, barefoot and shirtless, the cold night air doing nothing to dull the panic surging through him. The entire western side of the barn was engulfed, flames licking hungrily at the dry wood. Shadows of panicked horses danced against the lit-up yard as they kicked at their stalls. "Fire!" Barrett's shout ripped through the night as he sprinted toward the blaze. "Hank! Billy! Everyone out here now!" He could already hear the ranch hands stirring in the bunkhouse, but there was no time to wait. Grabbing the water pump handle, Barrett worked it furiously, his muscles straining as he filled the first bucket. The water splashed uselessly against the inferno. They'd never stop it this way. Then he saw her. Susanna, still in her nightgown, was already at the barn doors, wrestling with the heavy latch. The flames reflected in her wild eyes as she threw the doors wide, immediately engulfed in a cloud of smoke. "Susanna, no." Barrett dropped the bucket and ran, but she'd already disappeared inside. The heat hit him like a physical wall when he charged in after her. Through the smoke, he could see Susanna at the far stalls, her slender arms working with surprising strength as she released terrified horses one by one, slapping their haunches to send them bolting to safety. "Barrett." Her smoke-roughened voice carried over the crackling flames. The last stall, the mare's foaling. He didn't hesitate. Shouldering through burning debris, Barrett reached the stall where the frantic mare paced, her eyes rolling white with terror. The smell of singed hair filled the air as embers rained down around them. "Easy, girl," Barrett murmured, moving with deliberate calm even as sweat poured down his back. He grabbed a nearby blanket, throwing it over the mare's head to blindfold her before leading her toward the exit. Susanna was right beside him, one hand on the mare's flank, the other pressed against her rounded belly. "She's close to birthing." The stress. A support beam groaned above them. Barrett barely had time to shove Susanna and the mare forward before it crashed down where they'd been standing. "Run!" They burst from the barn just as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. The ranch hands had formed a bucket line from the well, but Barrett knew it was too late. The barn was lost. He turned to Susanna, his hands shaking as they gripped her shoulders. "What were you thinking going in there?" Her face was streaked with soot, her nightgown torn and smoldering at the hem, but her eyes were steady when she met his gaze. The animals couldn't save themselves. Behind them, The mare let out a distressed whinny, her sides heaving. Susanna immediately went to her, kneeling in the dirt despite her own coughing. She's going into labor. Barrett stared at this woman, his wife, who had just risked her life for livestock, who now knelt in the dirt, tending an animal, while her own hands blistered from the burn she'd ignored. Something hot and fierce rose in his chest, more overwhelming than the fire behind him. Hank appeared at his side, breathing hard. "Boss, that weren't no accident. Saw someone riding off just before the flames started." Barrett didn't need to ask who. Victor's parting threat echoed in his mind. "I'll be back for what's mine." But as he watched Susanna murmur soothing words to the laboring mare, her gentle hands already working to bring new life into the world amidst the destruction, Barrett realized with sudden clarity that Victor had made one fatal miscalculation. Susanna wasn't just part of the ranch Victor wanted to take. She had become the heart of it, and Barrett would die before he let anyone take her away. The bank notice arrived on crisp white paper, the black ink stark and final. "Foreclosure proceedings will commence in 30 days. Barrett stared at the words until they blurred, the weight of them pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The fire had been the final blow. Without the barn, without the stored feed, without the mare who had barely survived foaling, he was done. The creak of the porch swing drew his attention. Susanna sat with her mending in her lap, though her hands were still. She'd been quiet since the fire 3 days prior, moving through her chores with bandaged hands and shadows under her eyes. Barrett stepped onto the porch, the notice crumpling in his fist. "We need to talk." Susanna set aside her sewing, her gaze dropping to the paper in his hand. She didn't ask, she already knew. He sat heavily beside her, the words ash in his mouth. "I'm going to see Victor tomorrow." Her head snapped up. "Why?" "To make a deal." Barrett stared out at the charred remains of the barn. "If I sell to him now, he'll give us enough to start over somewhere else." Susanna's hands clenched in her lap. "This is your home." "Not anymore." The admission cost him more than he'd expected. "I can't ask you to stay here, watching everything fall apart." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant lowing of cattle and the chirp of cicadas. When Susanna finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your mother's Bible. Have you looked at it since I left it out for you?" Barrett frowned at the sudden change of subject. "No." Susanna rose and disappeared inside, returning moments later with the worn leather book. She opened it to a marked page and handed it to him. "The righteous will flourish like a palm tree, planted in the house of the Lord. They will flourish in the courts of our God. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green." Barrett read the words twice before looking up. "I don't understand." Susanna knelt before him, her bandaged hands covering his. "When I first came here, I thought God had brought me to this marriage to save me." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "But I think maybe he brought me here to save you too." Barrett's breath caught. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a yellowed piece of paper. "I found this when I was cleaning out the attic trunk. It's the original land deed, signed by your grandfather and mine." Barrett took the fragile paper with trembling fingers. As he unfolded it, a smaller slip fluttered out, a banknote marked paid in full with his father's signature. Susanna's voice was steady. "Your father paid off the last of the mortgage before he died. The bank has no claim here." Barrett's vision blurred. All this time, all the worry, the sleepless nights, the desperate choices. Why wouldn't he tell me? Susanna's fingers brushed his cheek, coming away wet. "Maybe he knew you needed to find your own way, to choose this life." Her hand moved to cover his heart, not out of duty, but love. Something shattered inside Barrett then. All the walls he'd built, all the excuses he'd made, crumbled to dust. He pulled Susanna to him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and hope and promises long overdue. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I choose you," he whispered. "I choose this life. With you." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Barrett Langston felt something he'd thought lost forever. Peace. The morning sun streamed through the stained-glass windows of Cedar Ridge Community Church, casting pools of jewel-toned light across the wooden pews. Susanna smoothed her hands over the skirt of her pale blue dress, the first new one she'd owned in years, and tried to steady her breathing. Next to her, Barrett stood tall and straight in his Sunday best, his broad shoulders nearly brushing hers. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the way his calloused fingers flexed at his sides, as if resisting the urge to reach for her hand. The entire congregation had gone silent when they'd walked in together. Susanna knew what they saw. The cattle baron who'd married the plain woman out of obligation, now standing proudly beside her, as if she were the finest treasure in Texas. She caught the whispers, the turned heads, the way even Reverend Matthews had paused mid-sermon when he noticed them sitting shoulder to shoulder. Barrett leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. "Stop fidgeting." His voice was low, meant only for her, but the hint of amusement in it made her cheeks flush. "I'm not," she whispered back, though she immediately stilled her hands. His lips quirked in that almost smile she'd come to cherish. Then, bold as brass, his pinky finger hooked around hers where it rested on the pew between them. A tiny connection, but it sent warmth flooding through her chest. The sermon ended with a prayer, and as the congregation rose to leave, Susanna found herself face to face with Mrs. Henderson, the town's most notorious gossip. The older woman's sharp eyes raked over Susanna's dress, her neatly pinned hair, the way Barrett's hand now rested possessively at the small of her back. My, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Don't you clean up nice, Mrs. Langston?" Before Susanna could respond, Barrett stepped forward. "My wife always looks beautiful," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded aisle. "It just took me too long to see it." A hush fell over those nearby. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Susanna's heart swelled so large she thought it might burst from her chest. Outside, the Texas sun beat down mercilessly, but Susanna barely noticed. Victor Dayne stood near the hitching post, his expensive suit at odds with the dusty street. His eyes locked onto them as they descended the church steps. Barrett's hand tightened on Susanna's elbow, but she placed her fingers over his in silent reassurance. "Langston," Victor called, tipping his hat with mocking politeness. "Mrs. Langston." His gaze lingered on Susanna in a way that made her skin crawl. "I hear congratulations are in order. Seems you've managed to keep your land after all." Barrett moved slightly in front of Susanna. "We have." Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Pity. I had such plans for that property." His gaze flicked to Susanna again, and its occupants. Something dark and protective flared in Barrett's expression. He took a step forward, but Susanna placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Dayne," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I believe you'll find everything you truly need inside that church." She nodded toward the building, though I suspect you haven't stepped foot in one in quite some time. Victor's face darkened. One of his hands twitched toward his belt, where a gun would normally hang. But of course, he'd left it outside the house of worship. Barrett straightened to his full height, his voice dropping to a dangerous timbre. "I believe my wife just invited you to seek salvation, Victor. I'd take that offer if I were you." For a long moment, Victor stared at them, his jaw working. Then, with a scoff, he turned on his heel and strode toward his waiting horse. As he rode away in a cloud of dust, Barrett exhaled sharply. "You," he said, turning to Susanna with something like wonder in his eyes, "are remarkable." Susanna smiled up at him, the last of her fears melting away like morning mist. "I had a good teacher." The walk home was slow and meandering, their joined hands swinging gently between them. The ranch came into view, the rebuilt barn standing proud, the garden Susanna had nurtured now overflowing with late summer blooms, the house that had once felt like a prison now a true home. Barrett stopped suddenly, turning to face her. "Susanna Bellamy Langston," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't think I ever properly proposed to you." Susanna's breath caught. "No, you didn't." He went down on one knee right there in the dirt road, heedless of his good trousers. Taking both her hands in his, he looked up at her with those intense blue eyes that had first unnerved her, then captivated her. Will you marry me? Not for land or duty or anyone else's plans. Just because I love you. Because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Tears blurred Susanna's vision as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Every day, yes. Barrett stood in one smooth motion, lifting her clean off her feet as he kissed her soundly. Somewhere in the distance, a chorus of whoops and hollers erupted. The ranch hands had apparently been watching from the porch. As Barrett set her back down, Susanna laughed, the sound light and free. The sun warmed her face. The man she loved held her close, and for the first time in her life, Susanna knew, without doubt, exactly where she belonged. If you enjoyed Barrett and Susanna's journey from strangers to soulmates, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt historical romances. Let us know in the comments, what was your favorite moment in their story? Would you like to see more tales from Cedar Ridge? And remember, true beauty is never skin deep, and love often arrives in packages we don't expect. Until next time, may your own stories be filled with grace, hope, and happy endings.